Hey, everybody, welcome on back. It's Barstool Boxing. It's your old buddy Large, and I'm sitting here with a legend. I'm actually nervous. I don't get nervous that often, but once this gentleman had sat down and his dulcet tones started to come through my headphones, it just brought back such a rush of emotions, and it's nothing but positivity. It's Jim Lampley. I got to meet Jim once in Vegas after interviewing Canelo. I think I was doing something goofy, like I had an arm sling on because Berlanga hit me in my Canelo tattoo. Like I was doing all that goofy stuff. And I bumped into a gentleman that's basically not the most serious guy in the world, but one of the guys that was instrumental in legitimizing boxing on TV as far as I'm concerned. So Mr. Lampley, I'm going to call you Jim at some point, but it's an absolute honor to have you here, and it's a pleasure to be talking to you. Before we even get started, I'm going to mention at the top of this, Jim's going to be ringside. PPV.com, excuse me. There's no, you don't need to sign up for this thing. You don't need to have a subscription. So you can just pay to play and watch all the fights and hear a legend like Jim Lampley commenting on it. So he's going to be doing the Tank Davis fight this weekend. On top of that, he just dropped a book. The book's called It Happened, A Uniquely Lucky Life in Sports Television. Go ahead, Jim.
First, slightly corrective
Please.
note. You hear Jim Lampley
yes,
because you're seeing his words in text.
Correct.
So you've heard Jim Lampley before.
Yes.
You sort of know that voice from your years of watching boxing.
Mm-hmm.
And now you are in a text chain with a lot of other people, you yourself included.
Right.
Dan Canobio, Chris Algieri, Lance Pugmire are my three colleagues at ringside. We're commenting on the fight in text. You're kicking back at us, commenting on the fight yourself in text. It's totally cooperative. It's a new media entity. And yeah, to the degree that they're hearing me, it's because they see the words in text and they know it's my voice, and they can do that from memory. But at the end of the day, it's all achieved via words on digital.
So it's an interactive experience that
Totally.
boxing fans
Absolutely,
have.
totally.
And you can have a lot of interactive experiences when you're watching boxing, but a lot of that deals with you yelling at the guy in the bar stool next to you, telling him
Or
to shut
yelling
the hell up.
at the three other people who are in your room. Because,
Yes, exactly.
Let's face it, boxing to this day is one of those sports that you want to watch with somebody. And to a large degree, as you certainly know, over the decades, going back to the 19th century, it's been handed down from fathers to sons,
right?
From uncles to nephews, from older neighbors to younger people in the neighborhood. It's been a generation to generation kind of experience. And it was actually my mother who gave me boxing after my father had died.
My mom and dad are both Irish immigrants, so they came over here. My dad was 19, so born in Bronx and raised in Brooklyn. But when I was growing up, I was born in 1971. He used to take us for closed circuit boxing matches because he just didn't like American sports. It wasn't his thing. So I got to watch the Four Kings live, at the Graham Theater and whatnot.
That's fantastic.
I consider it, you talk about gateway drugs, I consider that tar heroin. That is the best way to get a kid hooked on something, to throw Hagler, Hearns, Leonard, Duran, and Iran Barkley, to throw anybody in that generation in front of a kid, you kind of fall in love with what they're doing. Do you think that there's something now that provides the kids that gateway drug that I'm talking about? Like, where do you find the most inspiration for a person who just wants to get into boxing watching now?
Well, a lot of younger people now get it from MMA, and I am in my 70s and have not acculturized myself to be an MMA fan because I am a boxing person. I see myself on that side of a dividing line if there's a dividing line there. But if I were to say to some person who said, well, I really like MMA, who is a boxer that I might want to watch, it's the guy that we're covering this Saturday night, Tank Davis.
Right.
Because Tank Davis is a lights-out puncher, and he doesn't just knock his opponents out, he annihilates them. It's very much in the same character as the early fights that made Mike Tyson's reputation when he was coming up in the heavyweight division. So to anybody who's saying, I don't know if I've seen a boxer who's violent enough to satisfy my taste for that, I would say watch Tank Davis.
What's wrong with boxing? What's wrong with boxing right now?
The
Because
same things that have been wrong with it since the 19th century.
Give it to me.
Subjectivity, the inability to create some kind of scoring system that everyone buys implicitly without kicking back at it. It's as much a part of boxing as gloves and trunks that decisions are going to elicit some protest from a significant part of the audience, because it's just very difficult to boil it down into something. You mentioned AI. I don't know enough about AI. I am not digitally oriented enough at this moment to tell you whether AI can solve this problem, but I don't doubt for a second that somebody's going to come along to find a way to use that within a scoring formula, just the way Bob Canobio came along in the early 1980s, along with a partner and friend named Logan Hobson, to say, we can create a ringside statistical model for scoring fights that will perform in the newspaper the same way that a box score does, or a statistical summary for basketball, or any of the other sports that present numbers on paper next to the names of the competitors that convince the audience that this is what happened in the event. Boxing, it at first was not regarded as a likely prospect for that to happen, but it did happen, and now CompuBox has an enormous level of credibility that people don't push back on.
But don't you think then fundamentally the way that it is, since you do know so much about the judging end of it, and I'm a big fan of Dan. I'm a big fan of Dan Canobio, and obviously
I am too.
Yeah, and I say that reluctantly. Fucking Dan. But don't you think now that we're at that inflection point where we do need to go, not necessarily the AI route, but maybe just have the judges away from ringside, where certain outside, forces cannot act upon them. Give them access to all this CompuBox numbers. Give them something so the fan at home is having almost the same exact experience as the judge is having. Because I think when I sit ringside, I'm lucky enough to sit ringside every now and again, or I sit next to a judge, they are watching a different fight than the fan at home is.
I think there's a lot to be said for that, and I don't doubt at all that we will eventually follow that path. More and more computerization, digitalization, technical application of informational systems to try to get closer and closer to perfection. And we're never going to get to perfection. The fact is that every time you take a step down that road, you are further removing boxing from its original 19th century cultural roots. And you mentioned something about being Irish and coming from an Irish background. Mm-hmm. It's important to understanding the history of boxing that the first media public entity in the United States, the first media superstar in American culture, was John L. Sullivan. John L. Sullivan's, whose name and quote, I can lick him some bitch alive, appeared behind every bar in America.
Language, please. I'm sorry to my audience already. I have Jim Lampley saying some bitch on this thing. I'm just kidding, Jim. You can say whatever the hell you want.
I'm so sorry for that.
Yeah, that's like a lullaby
but
to me.
Sullivan said it in the 19th
absolutely.
century, and he got away with it. So, at the end of the day, the point I'm making is that boxing's roots are indelibly woven into a cultural progression which takes us back to 19th century America, which remind us of everything that has happened in the long course of history since then. And there are many, many boxing fans who don't want to surrender that, whether they are thinking explicitly about that or whether it's just deep in their souls. There are a lot of people who don't want to give up the idea that the three judges at ringside know what they're doing and are the right level of arbitration for figuring out who won the fight.
But boxing is cleaner now because you've covered boxing through, was it Panama Lewis? Panama Lewis here,
Yes.
All those other
Boxing
things.
is cleaner now
Yes.
because governing organizations were gradually brought to realize that chemical pollution could and would take place as the chemical culture of the United States continued to progress through the 20th century. Yep. Let's face it, performance-enhancing drugs, that's not something that existed in the 30s and 40s.
Right.
And then eventually it did. And
so little antihistamines in the water bottle.
Something had to be done with regard to that, and there's still pushback to this day. I mean, Ryan Garcia comes to New York whacks out Devin Haney, tests positive dramatically and graphically for an anabolic steroid drug after the fight. He says, oh no, that's BS. This is not correct, da-da-da-da-da, when in fact we ought to have recognized enough about science to know that it is correct. And yes, Ryan, you were dirty. And now, of course, there's going to be a process toward a rematch of Ryan Garcia and Devin Haney, which will build off a big platform, which is a pair of fights, the two of them appearing together in Times Square.
Yes.
In the biggest landmark area you can name in Manhattan. So boxing is uniquely positioned among all sports to build off its mistakes moment by moment toward bigger and bigger moments.
Talk to me about the book. I mean, a guy like me, I'm 50 some odd years old, 52 years old, and I feel like I have a nice story to tell. I've done certain things in my life, but I haven't even scratched the surface when it comes to a gentleman like yourself. You know, being involved in so many Olympic Games, being involved in boxing for so long, and also being involved in others. What other sports have you covered that people would probably be surprised that you were covering?
Well, I've covered every sport.
You covered every sport. Okay.
I began as the very first person ever to stand on the sidelines of a college football game with a camera and a microphone. I shared that distinction with a guy named Don Tollefson, who went on to great local television career in Philadelphia. But I was chosen out of a talent hunt in 1974 to be the first person to occupy this, quote, gimmick role, unquote. Ultimately, of course, it became an indelible part of the language of football. Every game has sideline reporters now, but I did that first in 1974, and then I needed to find a way up through the announcing hierarchy at ABC Sports, which was the #1 television network for broadcasting sports at that time. And you had a show called ABC's Wide World of Sports, and Wide World of Sports became my vehicle for upward mobility because I was the guinea pig who succeeded all of the great veteran announcers, Jim McKay, Frank Gifford, Howard Cosell, Chris Schenkel, Bill Fleming, several others, and I became the person who went to do the wrist wrestling 2 or 3 times. I went to do the log rolling in Wisconsin 2 or 3 times. Went to do the barrel jumping 2 or 3 times. Went to do the demolition derby on Long Island 2 or 3 times. I had to go repeatedly to do these things that everybody else had done just once to build my broadcasting career. And in the midst of that, along came ultra endurance sports. The first time I went to do the Ironman triathlon in Honolulu, the executives at ABC Sports were on the phone to me saying, you know, your first job is to go and suss out and tell us, does this actually take place? Do human beings actually swim 3.5 miles and then bike 112 miles and then run a marathon all in one package, all in one day? We're not really sure that we believe it happens. And I went to Hawaii and I said, it happens.
Free trip to Hawaii.
And that became a major telecast on ABC Sports, later to move to NBC Sports, now to have become a 9-figure global enterprise, the triathlon. And I later did a thing called the Race Across America, which is one of the most heart-stopping things you've ever seen, and went on for several years, and I wound up producing it myself at NBC years later, and that was a 3,100-mile-plus bicycle race from the coast of California to the Atlantic coast of the United States.
Wow.
And believe me, watching 2 bicyclists, Jock Boyer and Michael Sechrist, wheel to wheel with each other in the mountains of West Virginia after 8 days of biking, 22, 23 hours a day, no sleep, eating on the fly, et cetera, et cetera. That was as dramatic as anything I've ever seen. So I covered eventually track and field, swimming, 14 different Olympics. I did everything you can possibly do to build this career. And I wound up pretty much focused, concentrated on HBO boxing, calling all the fights for HBO, covering my favorite sport, the first sport that my mother had ever shown me as a child after my father died, which was boxing.
Why was your mom such a fan, though? Was your mom just a residual fan from watching your dad play?
My mom was a fan because of Sugar Ray Robinson.
Oh, there it is.
She liked the way he danced when he fought.
Wow.
She liked the level of for lack of a better term, I'll say sex appeal that he projected in the ring. And the first event, I was 6 years old. She sat me down at a neighbor's house at a party and put me in a room with a small television set on a TV dinner tray and said, sit here. You're going to watch the Gillette Friday night fights. Sugar Ray Robinson versus Bobo Olson for the middleweight championship, 1955. And this is their second fight. And if your father was still alive, this is what you would be doing. And oh, by the way, Sugar Ray Robinson's my favorite fighter. He dances when he fights. Now, there's 5 years from there to the moment when I saw Cassius Marcellus Clay competing in the middleweight competition at Rome for that Olympic gold medal, which he won, and he became my new hero. Because the other thing in which my mother had schooled and indoctrinated me was race relations. She was somehow or another, I don't know to this day, a poor Irish girl raised in Memphis who believed that racial equality was the single most important value in life. And she instructed me on that all through my childhood. And that became a through line to my obsession with sports and my appreciation for sports figures. And my biggest sports hero to this day was Muhammad Ali.
Who's the guy who's a must-see fight? You already mentioned Tank Davis, and I think that people are doing themselves a disservice if they don't tune in whenever this young man jumps into a ring. Who's the must-see fighter for Jim Lampley right now? Because some of these fighters, some of them that I love, I watch and religiously, but I could tell you they're not the best fighters in the world. I just watch them partially because of their personality and for other reasons. Who's that must-watch guy for you?
Well, I'll give you two. And by the way, Beterbiev and Bivol, who fought in Riyadh this past weekend, are two must-see fighters. But the true answer to your question is, if you really want to appreciate boxing greatness before he goes away, see Canelo Alvarez. Okay. Canelo Alvarez is a historic figure in boxing. He has a chance to go down as the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. That's as massive a cultural distinction as you can reach for in boxing, and Canelo has a strong case to present as the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. How do I know that? Because Marco Antonio Barrera and Eric Morales, two of the greatest Mexican fighters of all time in the lower weight classes, sat with me at the International Boxing Hall of Fame in Canastota, New York earlier this year and said to me, he has a case as the greatest Mexican fighter of all time. If they had not said it to me, I wouldn't feel as confident saying it to you. But he is must-see before he goes, and he's in the very last stage of his career right now. So that's one. The next one is David Benavidez. And David Benavidez is an American fighter from the Phoenix area, raised by his father to be a fighter. When he was 13 years old, he weighed 240 pounds. He lost 60 pounds to get down to a weight at which he could be effective as a boxer. And now he's very gradually putting weight on as he goes back up. He fights at 168. He fights at 175. He has a dream of putting all the weight back on at some point and becoming a heavyweight. Whoever is the very first Mexican-American legitimate heavyweight championship contender would be the biggest economic attraction in boxing at this moment, and one of the biggest economic attractions globally in the entire panorama of sports. And the one man in the United States who has the prospect of possibly doing that is David Benavidez. So the two must-see fighters are Canelo Alvarez and David Benavidez. Is it an accident that they both have Hispanic names? No, it isn't.
Right.
That's the culture that most supports the sport.
By the way, Andy Ruiz is watching this, and he's just crying into his.
Oh, yes, and many times I've said this and have thrown in the middle, please forgive me, Andy Ruiz.
Yes.
But I'm talking about for real.
Yes.
I'm talking about somebody you would pick to beat Joshua or Fury or Alexander Usyk, the best heavyweight in the world.
So then you mentioned two guys right off the bat. Canelo Alvarez, close personal friend of mine. Canelo and I
Ruiz
go way
knocked
back.
out Joshua. I need to say that while we're here, but go ahead.
But yeah, and And then Benavidez. So there was the talk of obviously those guys fighting at one point, and
Benavidez and Canelo?
Yeah.
I think it will happen.
It will happen. Do you agree with that? Like, I find that Canelo Alvarez, with his size, is middleweight, super middleweight. He should be extremely happy being the greatest middleweight and super middleweight fighter in the history of the sport. Perhaps certainly the best Mexican super middleweight ever in the history of the sport. Why does he feel the need to go up and fight somebody who is, I think, most comfortable at light heavyweight? David Benavidez, if he was to suck back down to 168, I don't think that's overly fair to him either. Weight classes exist for a reason. Why are boxers now not satisfied with just staying within their own weights?
Money.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's the answer to everything, I guess.
Large.
Right? Yes.
You are a very knowledgeable boxing
Yes,
fan. You
son
have
of a
proven
bitch.
that to me within the last 10, 15 minutes. You
Right.
obviously know a great deal. The answer is money. And why wouldn't it be? You know,
Yeah.
I mean, why do you think Canelo is still doing this after all
I
these years?
hated seeing him in
I
the
know
ring
he wants
against
to be the
Bivol.
greatest Mexican fighter of all time, but he wants to make more of that. I guess you never have quite enough fabulous ranches down in the Yucatan
Yes.
and tremendous meals with royalty of Mexican society, et cetera, et cetera. You haven't had quite enough of Jim Lampley coming up to you in the media room and saying, you know what, you're amazing, you're phenomenal, you've accomplished so much, you should be very proud of yourself. Maybe you want one more day of that. I don't argue with them, okay? Yeah. At the end of the day, fighters fight. That's what's in their gestalt. That's what they're going to do.
What would you be more excited for? Canelo versus a Terrence Crawford coming up, or Canelo going up for a David Benavidez?
I'm the world's biggest Terrence Crawford fan. Mm-hmm. I curated his career at HBO when he went from being a throw-in opponent on a pay-per-view card in Las Vegas to becoming what he now is, very arguably the number one pound-for-pound fighter in the world. I think the weight gap between him and Canelo and the style gap between him and Canelo is forbidding enough that I would prefer not to see him moving up to fight Canelo. Why is he doing it?
Money.
There you go.
I got it. You only have to tell me
once. We go
once,
back
Jim.
to the answer one more time.
Yeah.
And by the way, self-belief. That
Yes.
Terrence would not be doing this if he did not firmly believe that he can win. He does firmly believe that he can win. And why not? People have told him other opponents were too good for him, and he's beaten them all.
I think that's money is
A lot
number
of people
one.
thought Errol Spence was going to beat him. I was not under that delusion, but quite a number of people picked Spence to beat him. He annihilated him.
Yes.
So who's going to tell Terrence Crawford that he can't beat Canelo? Not me.
I think money is definitely one. I think 1A is ego. To your point, these guys are
And he wouldn't
surrounded.
be the great fighter he is without that ego.
Yes.
All right. That's what made Robinson Robinson.
Yeah.
That's what made Marciano Marciano.
Made Pacquiao going 8 different.
100%.
It always screwed. Like, one of my favorite fighters of all time was Vasily Lomachenko, and I always thought, just the way that he had that storied amateur career, including 2 gold medals. You know what? I'm going to ask you about that right away. When I've had gold medalists who become professional boxers, I'll use Loma as the example, and I asked them, what's the greatest feat for them in their career? 10 times out of 10, they say the gold medals.
100%.
More so than their belts, the whole idea. So covering it for the Olympics, tell me about the difference between the people that you've encountered doing 14 Olympics versus doing 40 years ringside.
Well, first of all, you can't dodge an opponent at the Olympics.
Yep.
Okay. You're not in that entrepreneurial position where you're taking the fight for a business purpose. And if you step around this one guy because you know that style is possibly poison to you, the public doesn't notice it all that much because the public is just like the boxers. They're focused on where's the money, and how big is the fight. The fight is this big because of money, et cetera, et cetera. So at the Olympics, you do not have the chance to avoid the best competition if the best competition is what's written into the draw in front of you. That's why Lomachenko is so proud of his Olympic accomplishments. He didn't choose those opponents.
Right.
Competition did. The oldest saying in the sport, or one of them, craft is king. His craft is like nothing I've ever seen. He is a spectacular technician, and I've seen him do things in the ring that you cannot imagine other fighters attempting, much less doing. So he's a great, great fighter. He's had a tremendous career, and there are fighters out there in or near his weight class that he probably shouldn't try to fight. Tank Davis is one of them.
Right. Yeah, you're absolutely right. PPV.com this weekend, if you guys want to watch
Tank Davis
Tank
versus
Davis
Lamont
fight,
Roach.
Lamont Roach, and you want to do it with a new platform where you can be a little bit interactive with one of the legendary voices of boxing, along with Dan Canobio, again, I'm going to say that shit, but mainly Jim Lampley. You can get in there, and it would be some sort of interactive chat. So you can get some stuff off your mind, and instead of yelling into your pillow or yelling at your wife, you'll be able to yell at Jim. So I think that's very exciting.
Chris Algieri, by the way, in the arena where he scored his unforgettable upset of Ruslan Provodnikov, which was yet another proof that craft is king in boxing.
So have you been, like, tested for some sort of genius type thing? Because your recall of names from the 1950s on up to the 2010s is like nothing I've ever seen. I've spent a little time with Dan Raphael, and he's got that too. You ever speak to Dan? Like, holy shit, everybody that he's ever seen fight is right at the tip of his tongue.
Which is work, okay? Because Dan didn't have a childhood in boxing. Dan came to boxing through professional opportunity, all right? I forget whether it was USA Today or somewhere that he worked before that, where he was asked to cover the boxing, and he had not done so before. And he buckled down, and he learned, and, you know, he is as credible a ringside source for any question as any writer has ever been. I put tremendous faith and trust in Danny Raphael. I got it from the time I was 6 years old, and my mother sat me down and said, by the way, the other thing she said was, in the next 90 minutes, a man named Don Dunphy is going to tell you everything you need to know about boxing. The person who assigned me to boxing at ABC Sports in 1986 was trying to get rid of me. He thought that stylistically this would destroy me, and I would have to walk away from my contract at ABC Sports. He had no idea about my background in boxing. He had no idea that I had mowed lawns and washed cars to buy a ticket to Cassius Clay versus Sonny Liston February 25, 1964 in Miami Beach when I was 14 years old. He didn't know anything at all about that. And he assigned me to boxing thinking that it would destroy me. And of course, it became the fulcrum for the book that sits in front of you on this table right now.
Let's give a shout out to Big George Foreman, right? That was the line of Big George Foreman.
And he's one of my greatest friends, and there's a George Foreman blurb on the back of the book.
Everybody that's going to speak when I finally write my book, it's going to be like the guy who makes my sandwich at the deli. Perhaps I'll convince an uncle to do it. You know, you read these forwards and whatnot, and I think Taylor Sheridan does the forward, and everyone that has commented on your book, there's just... it's almost a reverence.
You know why Taylor Sheridan wrote that forward?
Why is that?
Obsessive boxing fan.
Oh, is he really?
Absolutely obsessive boxing fan. At this moment in time, if you were to ask me who knows more about the current scene in boxers or among boxers, you or Taylor Sheridan, that answer is Taylor Sheridan.
Really?
Yeah, and he's coming to gyms in New York when he comes to town here, and he's going to gyms in Fort Worth, and he's training, and he's sparring with Caleb Plant and other significant fighters. So totally immersed. And I don't doubt that it's somewhat and somehow or another in his constant prolific output, there will be a series that touches on it.
What will people learn from this book?
One of my greatest spectator distinctions is I was at the Orange Bowl the night of Joe Namath's last college game.
Oh, really? How about?
I watched Joe Namath play for Alabama in his last college game against the Texas Longhorns. And on a night when Texas rolled up and down the field in the first half and built a 21-0 lead. And in the second half, Alabama brought Namath in. He had not played in 9 or 10 games because of the knee injury. Yeah. Steve Sloan, his replacement, was the Southeastern Conference Player of the Year. So Bryant benched the Southeastern Conference Player of the Year, Steve Sloan, to put Namath on the field. The drama was stunning, overwhelming, etc. Namath took the Tide down the field to 3 touchdowns. Bryant went for 2 after every touchdown. Inexplicable, and they lost the game.
Really?
Yeah. And the following day, Namath signed the famous $427,000. Think about it.
Yeah.
$427,000 package contract with the Jets that totally revolutionized professional football compensation. And now it sounds like loose change.
Who's the greatest outside of me, I should preface that, but outside of me, who's the greatest, most meaningful human being that you've ever covered?
Muhammad Ali.
Oh, it's Muhammad Ali. Okay, so he's number one with the bullet.
Number one with a bullet.
Okay. Can I go below Muhammad Ali? Muhammad Ali's an easy answer.
Al Michaels covered the Miracle on Ice.
Yes.
He called it with Ken Dryden, never to be forgotten, okay? I was sent at the last minute to see if I could gather somebody for a post-game interview to use going off the air that night because the game took place at 5 o'clock. Mm-hmm. Most of the nation, in fact, almost all of the nation didn't see it live. The only people who saw it live were people like me who were in the ABC Sports production facility in Lake Placid watching it being taped. And I was sent to the arena between periods 1 and 2 to be ready to find somebody to interview after the game. And I wound up doing an interview with Mike Eruzione and Jimmy Craig on the main street of Lake Placid outside of a little Italian restaurant in the last 7 or 8 minutes before McKay took the telecast off the air. That is probably my most indelible memory outside of boxing because it was, and it falls under the title, it happened. It was totally unexpected. It was not the last thing I said to Arledge on the telephone when he called and said, "You've got to go do this." I said, "Rune, I don't have the right credential to get into hockey." In those days, if you didn't have the right credential, you weren't going anywhere at the Olympics. And I said to him, "I don't have the hockey credential. I can't get in." And Arledge said, "You'll get in." Clunk. And
Good old Rune.
I got in. I watched on a camera platform. I watched all the players stream out of the dressing room. They were turning away from me in the opposite direction. I was yelling and yelling. They didn't hear me. The last player who came out was Eruzione. We had the same agent. I had met him a few days before. He recognized my voice. And I closed the telecast that night with an interview with Craig and Eruzione on the main street of Lake Placid. And just before McKay threw to us to go on the air, Eruzione turned to me and said, "Jim, if we had stood in exactly this," and there were thousands of people behind us, and he said, "Jim, if we had stood in exactly this spot last night at this time," and I filled in the blank and said, "Nobody would have noticed." He said, "Exactly."
Yeah.
And that's how much the world changed within 24 hours. The most unexpected, the most unlikely, the most emotionally uplifting upset I've ever seen in sports. I have, at Olympic events and other gatherings, run into Jimmy and Mike, or just Mike, many times. And every time I've seen Mike Eruzione since then, I have said to him, it's always the same setup. I say, "Mike, through the miracle of videotape, you are now the leading goal scorer in the history of hockey." And Mike has every single time looked at me with a little smile and said, "Jim, keeps going in, doesn't it?"
Yeah. Yeah, that's perfect.
And it does keep going in.
Right.
And it's still a miracle.
How do you feel about Alexander Usyk?
He's great. He's phenomenal. I mean, first of all, I thought that Tyson Fury was doggone near unbeatable.
Right.
All right. I thought there were all sorts of reasons why Tyson Fury was unbeatable. Usyk proved that I was wrong about that. Usyk is a one-of-a-kind heavyweight. I'm not sure we've ever seen a heavyweight with exactly that panorama of skills. There's a sort of ongoing wave in the sport right now among media. Is Usyk the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world? And more people every day are saying, "You know what? I get it. He is the best pound-for-pound fighter in the world. Look at how he wins the fights and how he's able to adapt to circumstances." He beat Fury 2 different ways.
Yes.
So I think he's an amazing fighter and a very deserving heavyweight champion.
Generational guy who should moonwalk into the Hall of Fame.
By the way, look at where he comes from. Ukrainian instruction.
Yes.
Vasily Lomachenko.
Exactly.
We're back to what we've been talking about all the way through this interview.
Klitschko's also.
Craft is king. The Klitschko's were fabulous technicians. One of them, Vladimir, was a very special athlete. The other one, Vitaly, was a very special person with a tremendously dominant ego and persona. My very, very close friend, Emmanuel Stewart, probably the closest adult friend I ever had. One day I asked him, "Okay, you've been in the gym with both of them. If they were to fight, Vitaly versus Vladimir, who wins the fight?" And he said, "Jimbo, never bet against Big Brother. Never bet against Big Brother. When the Harbaughs played each other in the Super Bowl, never bet against Big Brother.
Right? Yeah, that's true. I have a big brother, so I just don't like that saying. How do we feel about the fight this weekend? How do you feel about Tank Davis this weekend?
Lamont Roach is a nice person, very good fighter.
That's not a good sign, by the way. When you ask somebody to talk about a fight,
you can see where this is going.
I fought in college, Jim. I was 7-5. Whenever people asked about my fights, they would say, that large, nicest guy in the world. But he's about to go down. So talk to me.
I'm shocked if Lamont Roach has a way of beating Tank Davis. Tank Davis is a monster.
Right. But either way, it's always must-see TV when Tank Davis steps into a room, and then you attach Jim Lampley to it, it becomes even more must-see TV. But the only way you can do that together is at ppv.com. And again, you don't need to have any kind of subscription to this, a longer-term subscription, ppv.com for the Tank Davis-Lamont Roach fight. And go out and become a little bit more interesting. Get some sort of history in your excuse my language, in your small minds. Like I'm sitting here, I'm the sharpest.
Could I have done that?
I don't know.
Couldn't have done that.
You couldn't have done that. I wouldn't have let you get through it. I am the sharpest guy at Barstool. This guy might be the sharpest guy in the world. And we're both telling you it happened. A uniquely lucky life in sports television. With this guy, Jim Lampley, is going to be hitting the stores on April 15th. I could just sit here and listen to you all night. You can be my white noise machine, to be quite honest with you, Jim.
If they really want the book, and I love the book, I recommend it. If they really want the book, they can buy it right now on Amazon or BarnesandNoble.com.
Okay, Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com. This will drop this week before the fight, so obviously this is going to be salient, the times that he's given up.
Forward by Taylor Sheridan.
Taylor Sheridan, everything that you want to know about boxing and
Blurb
beyond.
on the back by John Grisham.
The son of a bitch. He's got everybody involved in this. I'm almost embarrassed that I
Blurb
didn't
from
get
Bob
a little
Costas,
bit.
Billie Jean King.
Is Dan Canobio in that goddamn thing? He better not be.
I called everybody
He
out.
did.
You know, it would have been Bob Canobio. Okay, I love Dan, but it would have been his dad.
Okay. Who's the most impressive guy in your cell phone right now that you can make a phone call to? I'm not going to ask you to. Who's the most impressive guy in Jim Lampley's
At
cell
this
phone?
moment in time?
Yes. I'm Canelo Alvarez.
Who in the culture matches Taylor Sheridan?
Yeah, Taylor Sheridan, you're right there. Yeah, absolute monster.
He's the most prolific television screenwriter ever,
Right.
and it's all great stuff.
I had mentioned he couldn't even let me be like, oh, Canelo Alvarez, you win, Large. Canelo Alvarez would kick Taylor Sheridan's
Canelo
ass.
Alvarez was my neighbor in Del Mar, California.
Jesus Christ, I can't have any.
We
I don't know how you do it, Deborah. I don't know how you do it.
We shopped at the same grocery store.
Did you really?
Okay, see, yeah. So he's old hat to me, Canelo Alvarez.
He's been doing this since he's 15, right?
Yes.
And so he has basically nothing left to prove but signs maybe a 4-fight deal with Turkey Al-Sheikh. That's it for Canelo Alvarez. You don't want to see this gentleman fighting into his 40s, correct?
I don't want to see him fight into his 40s. I'm not sure I want to see him fight against anybody other than a legitimate, warranted opponent. David Benavidez keeps winning. That is a very natural fight that ought to take place. The winner of Beterbiev versus Bivol, which at this moment is Bivol, though they've each won one. If he wants to go up to 175 again and fight one of those guys, he's already lost to Bivol. A rematch with Bivol makes sense. But, at the end of the day, Canelo's proven enough. And oh, by the way, what's his greatest asset? His greatest asset is you cannot hurt him. You can't knock him off balance. You can't knock him down. Where does that come from? Horseback riding. Yes. He's been riding horsebacks all his life, mostly hunter jumper. He told me at one point when I was prepping for a fight, he said, Jim, I get up and I ride 2.5 hours of hunter jumper in the morning. I do 3 hours of boxing training in the afternoon. Right. I said, how can you do that? He said, 2 different sets of muscles. The horseback riding is all legs. The boxing is all upper body. He's had one official knockdown scored against him in his career, and it was a moment when he got caught with a big shot to the chest and bounced off the ropes, and the referee ruled that the ropes had kept him up. Has he ever been on the canvas? No.
Yeah. I think the knockdown guy had stepped on his foot, too. It's my favorite picture of Canelo. He's sitting there with the most glorious steed I've ever... I didn't want to check my cell phone. It would seem rude, but I had to see that picture of Canelo with the most glorious steed I've ever seen in my life. He loves horses.
That is his passion.
It is.
Boxing is his profession.
Well, geez,
horseback riding is his passion.
I should have said that. This is a tough interview for me. Jim, it's an absolute pleasure having you here. Anything else I want to get off my chest while you're here?
Your large chest.
Yeah. Inway, how do you feel about him? I mean, the American audiences haven't really been properly introduced to the monster. I mean, I think he's one of those guys that will be in
How do you say
conversation.
it? A historic talent, a generational talent, an incomparable talent. He has done what Lomachenko was able to do in calling attention to the lower weight classes, but he does it far more than Lomachenko with power. And, for a 122-pound guy to have lights-out punching power the way he does, it's another step forward in the evolution of the sport. He's great, beyond great.
Sonny Liston. So I hear the stories about people say that Sonny Liston, I was lucky enough to shake George Foreman's hand, and it was like shaking a Bible. It's like shaking a cinder block. But people tell me Sonny Liston had cannonballs hanging off of either arm, which I think is a very good way to describe a deadly boxer like Sonny back in the day. Is there anybody whose physicality that you've met where you're like, Jesus Christ, this guy is from some other world?
No.
No, okay.
I saw Liston fight, and I saw him lose in Miami Beach to Cassius Clay.
Yeah.
But I have recently had the experience, and I'm not going to name him. I've recently had the experience of shaking hands with somebody whom I thought of as a colossally big puncher, and I was shocked to realize that for his size, he had relatively small hands.
He had petite hands.
Yeah, and that was surprising to me because I fully expected larger than expected hands, but that wasn't the case. So Sonny Liston was, I'm not going to say a freak of nature. He was a big descendant of farm hands and agricultural slaves who brought the physical wherewithal to bear from that genealogical experience. And
he's
he
one of
was
14 and like on a plantation kind of, right?
colossally powerful.
Yeah. Everything. This guy knows more than me. This is the third time I'm going to wrap up this interview, but I'm going to ask you another question as soon as we wrap up. But this is Jim Lampley. He's one of my heroes. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate you tuning in on Barstool Boxing. And make sure that you tune in this week on ppv.com and go pick up the book ASAP. Thank you very much, Jim. It was an absolute honor. Thank you so much, my man. Impressive hands, right? Thank you. See you next time, guys.